Keep the doctor's Lucia letters. I'm not going to lose Valeria because of another one of yours fears. The silence that followed those words was more violent than any shout. In box number 7 of the emergency room, the white lights fell upon Lucia Ferrer's face while a nurse pressed a compress against the sheet stained red. Adrian Vega remained standing by the door with his coat already on and his phone vibrating in his hand. On the other end of the line, Valeria Montez cried with a desperation to perfect, begging him to come to the hotel before doing something crazy. Dr. Elena Robles tried to stop him, explaining that his wife showed signs of premature placental abruption and that the baby could go into distress at any moment. Adrian didn't even finish listening. He separated Lucia's fingers from the sleeve of his jacket, left his ring hitting against the metal railing, and walked out without looking back. No one in that room knew what to say. Lucia didn't either. She only stared at the closed door, understood that her marriage had just broken before her body. Nurse Marta lowered her gaze to hide her indignation, while Alina ordered an urgent ultrasound and commanded medication to be prepared to stop the contractions. Lucia was 29 years old, 31 weeks pregnant, and had been trying for more than an hour to convince everyone that the pain wasn't that serious. She had arrived at the hospital doubled over herself, accompanied by Adrian, but from the first moment, he had checked his watch as if the emergency were an uncomfortable meeting. When the fetal monitor emitted a sharp drop, Lucia looked for her mobile on the nightstand. She called once. Adrian rejected the call. She called a second time. The tone sounded longer, as if he were hesitating. On the third, someone answered without speaking. Lucia heard hotel music, a feminine breath, and Valeria's voice, murmuring that she shouldn't ruin the night for them. Then, the call was cut off. It was then that Lucia stopped begging. 6 years earlier, Lucia had left a house in La Moralea, carrying a single suitcase and a certainty that then seemed invincible. Love could build a life cleaner than power. She was the only daughter of Esteban Ferrer, founder of a hospital group with investments in banking, laboratories, and private insurance. Her father had tried to warn her that Adrian, at that time, a real estate businessman on the verge of bankruptcy, was getting too close to her with too many hurry and too many questions about the family. Lucia didn't want to hear it. To prove that she wasn't an obedient heiress or a bargaining chip, she temporarily resigned from her position in the family foundation, married without fair guests, and adopted the Vegas surname in all social documents. Esteban attended the ceremony, but remained in the background without intervening. Before leaving, he gave Tomas Aguilar, his trusted lawyer, a card for Lucia letters. On the back he had written a single sentence: "You want to return? You won't have to explain why." She kept that card for years without using it. Valeria Montez arrived at the company 4 years later, hired to modernize the Vega Group's image. She was intelligent, elegant, and knew how to detect the insecurity behind arrogance. She never attacked Lucia head-on. First she praised her for staying away from the spotlight. Then she insinuated that a discreet wife was perfect for a man destined to relate with more ambitious women. Adrian laughed at those phrases as jokes, but he began coming home late, hiding his phone and canceling dinners with poorly constructed excuses. When Lucia discovered she was pregnant, she believed the news would repair the distance. For a few weeks, Adrian went back to kissing her forehead and talking about the baby's room. However, he also began traveling with Valeria, defending her with an energy he never used to protect his wife and getting irritated every time Lucia asked questions. She saw photographs, invoices, and messages half deleted, but chose not to put the pieces together. Admitting the infidelity meant recognizing that she had broken with her father, hidden her financial help, and wasted years defending a man who perhaps had never loved her sacrifice, but the comfort it offered him. The afternoon of the emergency. Adrian had promised her to accompany her to a routine checkup. Lucia had been having pressure in her womb, insomnia, and a presentiment she didn't dare name. In the car, he answered 2 messages from Valeria and smiled in a way he no longer used with his wife. Before arriving at the clinic, Lucia felt a sharp pain and a wet heat between her legs. Adrian braked next to the emergency entrance, but during the journey to the box, he didn't let go of his phone. When Alina explained that they had to observe her immediately, he asked how long it would take because he had an important meeting. Lucia looked at him in disbelief. She never asked him to cancel his life, only to stay until they knew if their son was safe. Then came Valeria's call. She had reserved a suite in a nearby hotel, and upon learning that Adrian was with his wife, she faked an anxiety attack. She said she had taken pills, that she couldn't breathe, and that if he didn't come, she would make the relationship public. Adrian chose to believe the threat that suited him. In the present, Alina brought a chair to the bed and spoke with a frankness that left no room for empty comforts. The baby was still alive, but the heart rate showed alterations. They could try to stabilize the pregnancy, though an urgent cesarean might be necessary. Luce had to avoid any emotional pressure and sign an authorization for several procedures. The word authorization made her hand stop. In all her years of marriage, she had signed documents to make Adrian's life easier. Guarantees, temporary sessions. Limited powers permits to move common capital. That night, for the first time signing, could serve to get out of his reach. She asked if she had the right to request a transfer. Alina frowned and responded that, from a medical point of view, transferring her entailed risks, unless the destination had a maternal fetal unit of maximum complexity and a prepared team. Lucia opened her wallet with trembling fingers. Between a photograph of the first ultrasound and a bank card she barely used, she had found Tomas Aguilar's aged card. She had spent 6 years refusing to dial that number. Tomas answered on the first ring. He didn't ask why she was calling so late or why her voice seemed to break. He just said her name with a calmness that made Lucia close her eyes. She took several seconds to find the words. "I'm in the emergency room. Adrian left. The baby is in danger. I want to come home." On the other end, there was a brief silence, not of surprise, but of containment. Tomas answered that she shouldn't move, that a medical team from the Farah network would get in touch with Alina, and that he would notify Esteban. Lucia felt fear upon hearing her father's name. She asked if he was angry if he would receive her after so many years of distance. Tomas answered that Esteban had never closed the door, although he had respected her decision not to enter. That phrase pierced the armor that Lucia had been holding for too long. She didn't cry for Adrian. She cried because she understood that she had confused independence with isolation and pride with loyalty. She had defended a husband who abandoned her while avoiding a father who had waited without demanding an apology. Lena spoke by phone with a specialist from the Hospital Ferrer del Norte, a private institution located 40 minutes from Madrid and known for its neonatal unit. At first she was reluctant. Luce's blood pressure was unstable, and any transfer had to be done in a medicalized ambulance with surgical capacity. 10 minutes later, she received the data of a team already mobilized, a room prepared, and a sanitary helicopter available, and the road was blocked. The efficiency revealed not only money, it revealed foresight. Lena looked at Lucia differently and asked if she belonged to the Ferrer family. Lucia answered yes, although she hadn't used the surname for years. The doctor didn't ask more questions. She explained that as a conscious patient, she could authorize the transfer and restrict access to her clinical information, as long as there was a record of the risks. Lucia asked that no data be given to Adrian Vega without her express consent. She also requested that the internal record identify her as Lucia Isabel Ferrer. Pronouncing her full name produced a strange sensation, as if she were recovering a part of herself that she had locked away in her father's house. While they prepared the paperwork, Marta found Lucia's ring among the sheets. She gave it to her, thinking it had come off by accident. Luce held it on her palm. It was a simple platinum band that Adrian had placed during a small ceremony in Toledo, when he still talked about building a family different from the ones they knew. For years, that ring had represented a promise. Now it weighed like evidence. Lucia asked if they could leave it in an envelope, along with a copy of the transfer request. Alina warned her that Adrian could interpret it as a final decision. She answered that if a man needed a jewel to understand that he had abandoned his wife during an obstetric emergency, then the marriage had ended long before she took off the ring. There was no anger in her voice. That absence of anger was more disturbing than any scene. Marta put the ring in a transparent envelope, noted the time, and left it on the nightstand. Lucia observed the gesture with a newfound serenity, although each contraction reminded her that she could still lose everything. At the hotel, Adrian found Valeria sitting in front of a mirror with her makeup intact and a glass of champagne in her hand. There were no pills, ambulances, or signs of a crisis. When he demanded an explanation, she hugged him and said she needed to check if he would really choose her, but didn't return to the hospital right away. The vanity of having been chosen by a woman admired in his company relieved his guilt for a few minutes. Valeria assured him that Lucia was exaggerating, that pregnant women had bleeds and scares, and that a private hospital would never let anything serious happen. Then she slid Adrian's phone across the table and blocked Lucia's number. He saw it and didn't stop it. That omission would later be one of the memories he couldn't justify. At 11:30 at night, while Valeria talked about future trips, Adrian finally looked at the missed calls. There were 3 from Lucia and 1 from the hospital. He felt a jolt of unease, but told himself that if the situation were critical, someone would have insisted. He didn't understand that no longer anyone needed to locate him. The transfer ambulance arrived shortly before midnight. 2 doctors, a midwife, and a technician entered with a portable incubator medication and an advanced monitor. Alina reviewed every detail before allowing them to move Lucia letters. Tomas appeared behind the team with his suit wrinkled and his face more tired than she remembered. He didn't approach to hug her until she extended her hand. Then he leaned next to the stretcher and said that Esteban was waiting at the destination hospital. Lucia asked if her father knew that Adrian had left because of another woman. Tomas answered that he knew the essentials, but that he hadn't asked for explanations. He has only asked if you and the baby are alive, he added. Lucia turned her face so no one would see how her lips trembled. Before leaving, she signed the transfer request, the restriction of access to the medical record, and an authorization for Tomas to protect her legal interests during the hospitalization. Each signature seemed to close a door, however, for the first time. Closing a door didn't make her feel trapped, but safe. At the hospital Ferrer del Norte, Esteban waited next to the doors of the maternal fetal unit, wearing a dark coat over his house clothes and holding between his hands the same photograph of Lucia that he had kept since her wedding. When the stretcher appeared, he took a step toward it and stopped. Fearing to invade a space his daughter had denied him for years, Lucia looked at him. Her father seemed older, with completely gray hair, and a worry that no power could hide. She said, "Papa," with a barely audible voice. Esteban approached, took her hand, and kissed her fingers. He didn't ask why she had taken so long, nor did he utter any phrase of victory, only said that he was already there. Those 4 words tore down what remained of Lucia's resistance. As the doctors took her toward the operating room, she asked her father not to allow Adrian to know her location. Esteban nodded, although clarified that he wouldn't use his power to take revenge, but to guarantee that no one would decide on her or the baby's safety without her consent again. At 1:20 in the morning, Adrian returned to the first hospital. He walked in quickly, with his face prepared for a fight. He expected to find Lucia crying, perhaps furious, but still available to accept an explanation. Box number 7 was empty. The sheets had been changed, the monitor turned off, and Lucia's bag of clothes still on a chair. On the nightstand rested the transparent envelope with the ring and a copy of the transfer request. Adrian read it twice. The document indicated that the patient had been transferred by her own decision and under specialized supervision. But the receiving center field appeared restricted by confidentiality. He looked for Alina and demanded to know where his wife was. The doctor answered that Lucia had revoked her authorization to share information with him. Adrian raised his voice, claiming he was the husband and the father of the baby. Lena looked at him harshly and answered that being a husband didn't annul the rights of a conscious patient, and that being a father didn't consist solely of claiming information after having ignored 3 emergency calls. In the operating room, the doctors managed to temporarily stabilize the bleeding, but they warned that the next hours would be decisive. Lucia remained conscious while they prepared her for a possible cesarean. Esteban waited behind the glass with Tomas at his side. The lawyer gave him copies of the signed restrictions and explained that Lucia had also requested to begin the separation process as soon as her condition allowed it. Esteban closed his eyes. He could have used that news to celebrate that his daughter finally saw Adrian as he had always seen him. He didn't. He asked only what she needed to be protected. Tomas answered that, in addition to medical privacy, it was advisable to review the financial guarantees linked to the Vega Group, because any marital conflict could affect assets belonging to Lucia Letters. Esteban ordered everything to be audited without rushing movements that seemed like retaliation. He wanted facts, not impulses. Without knowing it, Adrian had just triggered a chain of consequences much greater than his wife's disappearance. The empire he thought he had built was only supported by a woman he had left bleeding in the emergency room. A little before dawn, Lucia opened her eyes in an obstetric intensive care room. The baby was still inside her, fragile but alive. Alina, who had accompanied part of the transfer and communicated the history to the new team, informed her by phone that the next 24 hours would be critical. Lucia asked to see her father. Esteban entered without escorts or assistance and sat next to the bed. She tried to apologize for the years of silence, but he asked her to save her strength. Lucia confessed that deep down, she had known Adrian was cheating on her. She also confessed that she had preferred to doubt herself rather than accept that her father was right. Esteban answered that he didn't need to be right, he needed to have his daughter alive. Then he placed on the table Tomas's old card, the one Lucia had kept for 6 years. "You haven't returned because you lost," he said. "You've returned because you finally decided to save yourself." Lucia closed her eyes and placed a hand on her womb. For the first time since the pain began, she didn't feel abandoned. At that same hour, Adrian remained sitting in the car in front of the empty hospital with Lucia's ring closed inside his fist. Valeria sent him messages asking when she would return to the hotel. He didn't answer. On the screen, a bank notification appeared. An important company operation had been held for guaranteed review. Seconds later, he received an email from the board of directors calling an extraordinary meeting. Adrian attributed both events to a coincidence and looked at the transfer request again. Below Lucia's signature was Tomas Aguilar's rubric as legal representative. He recognized the name. He was the lawyer who years ago had managed anonymously the credit that saved his first real estate promotion. A different cold ran down his back. The woman he had left alone had not simply changed hospitals. She had returned to occupy a place in the world that he had never wanted to understand. As Madrid dawned, Adrian understood that he couldn't find either his wife or her file, because for the first time Lucia had stopped living within the limits he controlled. Adrian didn't return home that dawn. He remained inside the car in front of the hospital until the Madrid sky began to lighten and traffic filled the avenue again. Every few minutes he looked at Lucia's ring, convinced that that platinum circle should lead him to her. He called reception, asked to speak with administration, threatened to report the center, and tried to use political contacts that on other occasions had opened doors for him. No one gave in. Dr. Robles had left precise instructions. The patient had withdrawn her authorization to share information, and any access attempt had to be recorded. Adrian didn't understand how a woman who for years had endured his silences could disappear so effectively in less than an hour. His pride looked for a comfortable explanation. He told himself that Lucia was punishing him, that she had organized the transfer to scare him, and that she would return when he apologized. But beneath those excuses grew a darker certainty. Perhaps she had stopped waiting for him definitively. At 7 in the morning, Valeria called him again. This time, she didn't fake tears. She spoke with irritation, asking why he had left her alone after having chosen to go to the hotel. Adrian answered that Lucia had disappeared and that the hospital refused to tell him where she was. Valeria went silent for barely a second before recovering her calculated tone. She assured him that this proved how manipulative his wife was, capable of using even a pregnancy to make him feel guilty.
Yes.
According to her, a truly serious woman wouldn't have had the strength to organize lawyers, ambulances, and privacy restrictions. Adrian wanted to believe her because the alternative was admitting that he had abandoned his woman at a critical moment. Valeria added that he shouldn't humiliate himself looking for her. Lucia had no close friends, barely dealt with her family, and depended emotionally on him. Sooner or later, she would return. As he listened, Adrian remembered Tomas Aguilar's name on the transfer document. He didn't mention it to Valeria. For the first time, a part of him suspected that she didn't know something important. When he arrived at the penthouse he shared with Lucia, he found the lights off and a silence different from other arguments. There were no open suitcases, empty closets, or ransacked drawers. The maternity dresses still hung by colors. The shoes were lined up, and on the dresser remained the bottle of vitamins that Lucia took every morning. In the baby's room, the star wallpaper covered a wall still unfinished. Adrian touched the crib they had chosen together and felt a discomfort he didn't want to call fear. He checked Lucia's office. Her laptop was still there, as was her passport, several personal documents, and a box with wedding memories. Only a blue folder he had never opened and a small toiletry bag that the doctors had probably prepared were missing. During the following hours he called his friends, hired a detective, and consulted several hospitals, but no one revealed anything. It was as if someone had removed Lucia from the reach of his life without needing to take anything, because everything that really protected her existed outside that house. Mercedes Vega arrived at the penthouse before noon, dressed as if she were going to a business lunch and not to a house where a pregnant woman was missing. She listened to the story without interrupting, and when Adrian finished, she didn't ask about her grandson's condition. She asked who had seen Lucia leave, what documents she had signed, and whether the press knew about the situation. Mercedes had spent years considering her daughter-in-law an uncomfortable presence. She couldn't stand that Lucia rejected society parties, avoided displaying the Ferrer surname, and seemed to observe each ambition of the Vegas from a moral distance that she interpreted as contempt. She assured her son that the disappearance was a maneuver. In her opinion, Esteban had waited for any mistake to recover Lucia and publicly humiliate Adrian. She suggested communicating that the young woman suffered emotional instability during pregnancy, so that any future statement could be attributed to stress. Adrian refused at first. Mercedes answered that reputation wasn't defended when the scandal broke, but before. That phrase hung over the table like a threat disguised as advice. Meanwhile, at the hospital Ferrer del Norte, Lucia woke up several times between mild contractions and the constant sound of the fetal monitor. The doctors had managed to reduce the bleeding, but the placenta remained partially detached. Any alteration could force them to perform a cesarean. Esteban remained in an adjacent room, although Lucia had asked him to rest. Every time she opened her eyes, she found a fresh cup of coffee on the table and the same dark coat hanging on the chair. Her father hadn't left. Tomas entered mid-morning with a folder of documents and waited for the doctor to authorize a brief conversation. Lucia asked him to initiate the legal separation, but she didn't want a media war or to use family influence to destroy Adrian. Tomas explained that protecting her would require reviewing notarial powers guarantees, shared accounts, and business decisions that could affect her. She nodded. For years, she had signed without asking, because she believed that supporting her husband was a form of love. She needed to know exactly what she had given away and what was still in her name. Tomas placed on the table a copy of a contract signed 6 years ago. When the Vega Group couldn't obtain financing to finish its first major real estate promotion, Lucia had contributed an investment portfolio inherited from her mother as an indirect guarantee. The operation was structured through a company administered by Ferrer Capital to prevent Adrian from knowing that Esteban was rescuing him. Lucia remembered that agreement. She had begged her father to help without revealing his intervention because Adrian was going through a crisis and said he felt looked down upon by the big banks. Esteban accepted with one condition: the guarantee would be protected by clauses that allowed reviewing the Vega Group's management in case of fraud, personal use of corporate funds, or serious harm against the beneficiary. Lucia never imagined that those words could acquire such a personal meaning. She asked if abandoning a wife in the emergency room activated any clause. Tomas answered that it wasn't about punishing an infidelity, but about checking whether that conduct was linked to financial movements, concealments, or decisions that put her assets and the babies at risk. The review began immediately. Ferrer Capital's lawyers detected repeated payments from the Vega Group to a luxury hotel, vehicle rentals, jewelry, and trips recorded as representation expenses. The invoices coincided with dates on which Adrian claimed to be negotiating with investors outside Madrid. Several reservations were linked to Valeria's corporate email. It still wasn't enough to speak of a crime, but it was enough to justify an internal audit and temporarily block a credit line backed by assets related to Lucia Letter's Esteban. Received the report in the hospital hallway. His first reaction was to order the withdrawal of all guarantees. But Tomas reminded him that a sudden move could destroy jobs and be interpreted as revenge. Esteban breathed deeply and accepted to proceed technically. Lucia heard part of the conversation from the room and asked that no innocent employee pay for Adrian's decisions. Even injured, she still thought about those who could be caught in the middle. Her father looked at her with a mix of pride and sadness, aware that compassion had been used against her too many times. At the Vega Group, the bank notification arrived during a treasury meeting. Adrian read that the entity temporarily suspended several operations until verifying the guarantees linked to an investment company. The financial director explained that without that line, they would have difficulty covering supplier payments at the end of the week. Adrian demanded to know who had requested the review. No one could answer. Minutes later, the board president sent an extraordinary summons to analyze representation, expenses, and conflicts of interest. Adrian felt the floor tilt beneath his feet. He called Tomás Aguilar, but the lawyer didn't answer. Then he telephoned Esteban Ferrer and received another refusal. Valeria entered his office without knocking, annoyed because he hadn't returned to the hotel. When she saw the documents on the table, her expression changed. She asked if that was related to Lucia letters. Adrian answered that he didn't know, although he was beginning to understand that his wife's disappearance and the financial crisis were not separate events. Valeria hugged him, but her eyes remained fixed on the visible invoices. That afternoon, Mercedes called a society journalist with whom she maintained a relationship of favors, though she didn't give names, but insinuated that a woman linked to an important business family had suffered an emotional crisis during pregnancy and had left a hospital against medical advice. She wanted to build a preventive version, and if Lucia reappeared denouncing Adrian, she would seem unstable. The rumor circulated first in private groups and then reached several Vega Group employees. Valeria used it to reinforce her position. During a meeting with the communications team, she stated that the company should prepare for possible false accusations born from a marital conflict. An assistant named Ines listened with discomfort. She had seen Valeria use the corporate card to pay for the hotel's suite the night before and knew that those reservations had no relation to any client. Ines kept silent but downloaded copies of the receipts before they could disappear. She didn't do it out of loyalty to Lucia, whom she barely knew, but because she understood that soon someone would try to make her an accomplice. Adrian returned to the original hospital at dusk and asked to speak with Alina again. The doctor agreed to receive him in an office, not out of obligation. But because she wanted him to understand the gravity of what had happened, she explained that Lucia had arrived with bleeding contractions and alterations in the fetal rhythm, also told him that her departure from the center had been carried out with all necessary means, but that the risk hadn't disappeared. Adrian asked if the baby was still alive. Alina answered that she no longer had authorization to communicate clinical information to him. He struck the table with his palm, accusing her of acting like a stranger. The doctor kept her calm. "You decided to become a stranger when you left," she said. Adrian wanted to justify that Valeria had threatened to hurt herself. Alina asked him why he didn't call an ambulance for her. Why didn't he ask the hotel for help? And why did he leave alone a patient who was bleeding before his eyes? He found no answer. For the first time, the story he told himself stopped seeming convincing. In the hospital room, Lucia saw a message appear on the new phone that Tomás had prepared for her. Old Mobile remained off and stored as possible evidence. For several minutes, she contemplated Adrian's phrase, "Just tell me if our son is alive." He didn't ask how she was either. No. Nor did he apologize for having left her. Lucia felt the urge to respond because there still existed inside her the woman who ran to reassure him, even when he was the one causing the harm. However, the doctor entered at that moment to check the monitor. The baby's rhythm had dropped again. While the team adjusted the medication, Lucia understood that every emotion had a physical consequence. She decided not to give her stability to a man who only seemed to remember the son when he feared losing control. She asked Tomás that all future communications go through the lawyers. Then she deleted the draft responses without sending them. It wasn't cruelty. It was the first clear boundary she placed in 6 years of marriage. The next day, the doctors confirmed that the bleeding was contained, although Lucia had to remain hospitalized and prepared for immediate intervention. The possibility of losing the baby was still present. Tomás brought the first separation documents and explained that it wasn't necessary to sign them all at once. Lucia read each page slowly. She didn't ask for a disproportionate compensation or Adrian's ruin. She requested the protection of her assets, the review of joint accounts and measures to prevent the Vega family from making decisions about the child without judicial authorization. When she reached the custody section, her hand trembled. She didn't want to erase Adrian as a father, but neither could she pretend that his conduct didn't matter. She wrote a note for the court to consider supervised visits until his responsibility could be assessed. Tomás asked her if she was sure. Lucia answered that parenthood wasn't a prize delivered by surname. It had to be demonstrated with presence, care, and truth. She signed only the initial request. The sound of the pen on paper seemed more definitive than that of the ring falling on the bed. In the penthouse, Mercedes ordered some of Lucia's belongings removed from the master bedroom and moved to a guest room. She said it was a practical measure, although in reality, she wanted to prepare the space for Valeria. Adrian caught her going through a drawer and demanded that she leave everything as it was. Mercedes laughed at his sudden sentimentality. She reminded him that he had chosen Valeria at the hospital and that now he should act with firmness. According to her, if Lucia returned, conditions had to be imposed. Therapy, silence before the press, and renunciation of any participation in the company. Adrian asked why she spoke of shares if Lucia didn't appear as a shareholder. Mercedes answered too quickly that all wives ended up claiming something. The evasion awakened a suspicion. Adrian remembered documents signed years ago, meetings Lucia had attended without intervening, and the ease with which financing was obtained when no bank trusted him. For the first time, he wondered how much his mother knew about the real origin of that money. Mercedes avoided his gaze and changed the subject, but the silence between them revealed a still-hidden complicity. That night, Valeria arrived at the penthouse with a small suitcase and a bottle of wine. She said she didn't want to leave him alone during the crisis. Adrian watched her enter Lucia's house without asking permission and felt an unexpected discomfort. Valeria toured the living room as if evaluating which furniture she would keep. Upon seeing the baby's room, she closed the door and assured that that space would only increase her anxiety. Then she proposed issuing a private statement to the board, affirming that Lucia had abandoned the home and that Adrian should temporarily assume total control of the family assets. He asked how he knew there were assets linked to her. Valeria smiled and said that every wife of an important businessman had some participation. Adrian wasn't satisfied. When she went to shower, he opened her laptop. He found several hotel reservations paid with corporate accounts, messages sent to Mercedes, and a draft titled Incapacity Protocol of LV. He couldn't access the content because it was protected, but the name was enough to freeze his blood. Valeria hadn't improvised that night. She had been preparing for some time. The next morning, Tomas received a call from Ines, the communications assistant. The young woman asked to speak under confidentiality and explained that Valeria had used company funds for personal expenses. She also mentioned private meetings with Mercedes and documents related to Lucia's supposed incapacity. Tomas didn't promise absolute protection, but indicated how to preserve the evidence without altering files or breaking the law. When he informed Esteban, both understood that the conflict went beyond an infidelity. There could exist a plan to discredit Lucia, remove her from any right and control the baby as heir. Esteban wanted to go immediately to the penthouse, but Lucia stopped him. She didn't want her father to solve the problem with threats. She needed to know who had participated, what documents existed, and how far Adrian went. Tomas agreed to expand the audit before leaving. He left on the table a copy of the first financial report. The cover appeared the name of the company that supported the Vega Group's guarantees. Lucia recognized it. It was the same one her mother had created to protect her inheritance. That afternoon, Adrian received an envelope delivered by courier at his office. It had no visible sender. Inside, he found a copy of the transfer request signed by Lucia, the record of the 3 calls he didn't answer, and a handwritten note from Esteban Ferrer. There were no insults or threats, just one sentence. "My daughter waited for you in the emergency room, longer than a man like you deserved to be waited for." Adrian read the note several times. Valeria, who sat across from him, tried to snatch it away, but Adrian closed the envelope. At that moment, another email arrived. The board demanded explanations about personal expenses, hidden guarantees, and possible conflicts of interest. It also informed that a representative of Ferrer Capital would attend the extraordinary meeting. Adrian looked up and asked Valeria what she had done with the company accounts. She denied any irregularity and blamed Lucia for using her father to destroy them. But Adrian was no longer listening. For the first time, he understood that he hadn't only lost track of his wife, he had lost the version of reality that allowed him to feel innocent. The board's extraordinary meeting began at 9 o'clock sharp in a glass-walled room from which Madrid's financial center could be seen under a gray sky. Adrian occupied the head, trying to maintain the firm expression he had used for years to intimidate banks, suppliers, and employees. However, that morning, no one avoided his gaze out of respect, but out of distrust. On the table were copies of hotel invoices, flights, jewelry, and private dinners charged to corporate accounts. The financial director explained that several operations were associated with representation campaigns that never existed. Valeria remained 2 seats from Adrian with a closed folder in front of her and a carefully serene face. When asked about the reservations, she claimed they were confidential meetings with potential investors. One of the board members asked for the names. She answered that she couldn't reveal them. Then the door opened and Thomas Aguilar entered, accompanied by 2 Ferrer Capital auditors. Adrian understood that the crisis had stopped being a domestic problem. Tomas didn't mention Lucia when sitting down. He introduced himself as legal representative of the company, which backed an essential part of the Vega Group's debt and requested immediate access to the original contracts. Adrian asked why a firm linked to Esteban Ferrer suddenly appeared in a company he had built without help. Tomas looked at him for a few seconds and asked that the financing agreement signed 6 years ago be projected. On the screen appeared a succession of companies' guarantees and clauses that Adrian barely remembered. He had signed those pages during the worst week of his career, when he had to pay the workers of an unfinished promotion and no bank agreed to lend him more money. At that moment, he believed that an international firm had bet on his talent. Tomas pointed to the section corresponding to the real beneficiary of the guarantee. There, under a fiduciary structure, appeared a full name that Adrian had never read carefully: Lucia Isabel Ferrer. The room fell silent, and even Valeria lost control of her expression for an instant. Adrian stood up and accused Tomas of manipulating documents to protect his client. The lawyer answered that the contracts were registered before a notary and could be verified at any time. He explained that Lucia had contributed part of the inheritance received from her mother to back the financing, but had demanded that Adrian not know about her intervention. She didn't want her husband to feel that he owed his company to the Ferrer surname. Furthermore, she had asked Esteban to stay out of management and to never use the guarantee to influence the marriage. Adrian then remembered a night from 6 years ago. He had arrived at the small apartment where they lived, convinced that he would lose the company, and Lucia had hugged him while assuring him that they would find a solution. 2 days later, the credit was approved. He interpreted that miracle as proof of his own worth. He never asked why Lucia seemed so exhausted, or why she had traveled to see her father after months without speaking to him. One of the board members asked if Ferrer Capital had the right to intervene in the company. Tomas clarified that they didn't intend to take control, but the guarantees included supervision clauses in case of fraud, concealment of expenses, personal use of corporate funds, or any action that endangered the beneficiary's assets. The payments linked to Valeria justified an audit. Adrian demanded to know if Lucia was behind that offensive. Tomas answered that she had asked to protect the employees and avoid any unnecessary harm to the business. That answer humiliated Adrian more than a threat, because it showed that Lucia still thought about unknown workers, while he had thought first about saving his image. Valeria intervened with a firm voice and stated that the invoices had been authorized by Adrian. He turned his head toward her. Some operations bore his electronic signature, but he didn't remember approving each expense. Valeria maintained that he had given her access to speed up decisions. The financial director confirmed that the president's credentials had been used from devices assigned to the communications department. The meeting was suspended for an hour to allow technicians to review the access records. Adrian took Valeria to his office and locked the door. He asked her how many times she had used his digital signature. Well, she answered that only when he was busy, and that she had never done anything he hadn't approved verbally. Adrian pointed to an invoice for a necklace purchased in Paris and recorded as a gift for a non-existent commercial delegation. Valeria recalled that he had given it to her after a trip. "You told me to charge everything to representation," she insisted. Adrian couldn't deny that he had allowed some abuses, but he also didn't remember authorizing larger transfers to unknown consulting firms. Valeria changed strategy, approached, lowered her voice, and stated that Lucia was using her father to turn a private affair into a corporate coup. According to her, the objective was to provoke Adrian's fall, take control of the company, and present the baby as sole heir. He wanted to reject that interpretation, although part of his pride clung to it to not accept a simpler truth. Lucia had protected what he was destroying. In the hospital, Tomas informed Lucia about the initial result of the meeting. She remained lying on her side, connected to the monitor, while a nurse checked the baby's rhythm. Upon hearing that Adrian had discovered who backed the company, Lucia closed her eyes. For years she had imagined that someday she would tell him in a moment of peace. Perhaps when the Vega group was stable and he could receive the truth without feeling diminished. Now, the revelation had occurred before a board that doubted his honesty. Esteban, sitting near the window, asked why she had hidden such important help. Lucia answered that Adrian needed to believe in himself. Her father replied that one thing was to give him confidence and another to build him a false world. She didn't argue. She recognized that she had confused love with silent protection, and that each secret meant to care for Adrian's pride had turned him into a man, incapable of recognizing how much he received. Tomas added that they still had to determine whether the electronic signatures had been used with consent or through deception. Lucia asked to see all documents related to the guarantee. Among them, she found letters written by herself at the beginning of the marriage. In one, she requested that the dividends from her assets be reinvested to maintain the employment of more than 200 workers. In another, she asked her father not to execute an overdue debt, because Adrian was going through a delicate negotiation. Those letters revealed a version of herself she had almost forgotten. A woman who solved enormous problems in silence and then returned home to pretend she had done nothing. Esteban confessed that he accepted those conditions because he feared losing her and opposed the marriage. He had hoped that Adrian, feeling supported, would become the man Lucia believed she saw. Instead, each success fed his arrogance. Lucia didn't blame her father. She said they had all protected Adrian too much from consequences. Tomas asked her if she wanted to immediately withdraw the guarantees. She answered that not yet. First, she wanted to know what part of the empire could be saved without endangering the people who depended on it. Ines met with Tomas in a cafe far from the office. She arrived nervous with an external memory hidden inside her bag. She had copied emails, authorizations, and internal conversations before Valeria ordered files deleted. She explained that in recent months her boss had spoken with Mercedes about a future declaration of Lucia's incapacity. The plan was based on presenting her anxiety episodes during pregnancy as proof of instability. If Lucia was considered temporarily incapacitated, Adrian could administer certain joint assets and make decisions related to the child. Ines didn't know if he knew about the project. She had seen Valeria draft documents but never witnessed a direct conversation with Adrian about that matter. She also delivered a message in which Mercedes suggested waiting until after birth to pressure Lucia into signing a waiver of her voting rights. Tomas kept the memory without making promises. He warned her that her testimony could place her in a difficult situation. Ines answered that silence would be worse if a sick woman ended up declared incapable by a plan she had seen grow. When the technicians concluded the first review, they verified that Adrian's digital signature had been used from Valeria's laptop at times when he was outside Spain. Some operations coincided with trips Adrian had made with her, so they could have been consented to. Others were harder to explain. There were payments to a company called Montes Estrategia, administered by a cousin of Valeria's, and transfers destined for a future home in Marbella. The board demanded blocking any pending operation and temporarily removing Valeria from financial access. She reacted, accusing everyone of submitting to the power of the Ferrers. Adrian didn't defend her. For the first time, he observed the woman he had chosen over Lucia without the protection of desire or secrecy. He saw ambition, fear, and an extraordinary speed to blame others. However, he also couldn't pretend that he was a victim. He had given her his passwords, had approved expenses without reviewing, and had allowed his relationship to use company resources. The signature could have been copied, but the irresponsibility that made it possible belonged to him. Mercedes arrived at the headquarters upon learning of Valeria's suspension. She entered her son's office, demanding that he stop the audit and expel the Ferrer Capital representatives. Adrian placed in front of her a copy of the incapacity protocol found on Valeria's laptop. He asked if she knew about the document. Mercedes denied having seen it, but her face revealed the opposite. He then showed several printed messages where she talked about protecting the Vegas surname and ensuring control of the heir. Mercedes tried to justify herself. According to her, Lucia had always had a greater loyalty toward the Ferrers and could take the child at any time. Preparing legal measures was a precaution, not a conspiracy. Adrian asked if she knew that Lucia had saved the company. His mother remained silent. Finally, she admitted that Esteban had mentioned to her years ago the existence of a family guarantee, although she didn't know all the details. Adrian understood that Mercedes had accepted the help while publicly despising the one who offered it. That hypocrisy seemed unbearable to him, perhaps because it reflected his own. In the hospital room, Lucia's condition worsened again. An intense contraction made the fetal rhythm drop and forced the team to prepare her for a possible cesarean. Esteban observed from the hallway as the doctors entered and exited quickly. For 20 minutes, no one offered him a definitive answer. In the end, they managed to stabilize the baby and decided to wait because each day inside the womb increased its chances of surviving. Lucia remained exhausted with pale skin and a hand resting on her womb. She asked if Adrian had tried to communicate. Tomas answered that he had sent several messages through his lawyers and requested information about the child. She wanted to know if he had apologized. The lawyer didn't answer immediately. That hesitation was enough. Adrian spoke of rights, not responsibility. Lucia asked that all messages be kept, but maintained the restriction. She didn't intend to punish him with uncertainty. She needed to get through those hours without turning every monitor alarm into another discussion about what he believed he deserved. Adrian spent the night reviewing boxes of documents stored in the company's historical archive. He found contracts that had remained unopened for years and meeting minutes he had delegated to advisors. In a folder appeared several authorizations signed by Lucy Ellers. She had renounced collecting dividends during the first 3 fiscal years and had allowed her benefits to be used to cover payrolls. She had also rejected a board seat so that investors wouldn't think the Vega Group was an extension of the Ferrer Empire. Each document dismantled the story Adrian had told himself about a dependent wife, alien to business, and protected by her fortune. Lucia understood the company better than he supposed. She had decided to remain invisible. Adrian remembered the times he mocked her lack of ambition. The dinners where he presented her as a woman dedicated to the home, and the occasions when Valeria insinuated that Lucia couldn't understand the pressure of running a company. He never defended her because he also believed that lie. Among the papers he found an unsent letter. It was written by Lucia 3 years ago, and addressed to Tomas. In it, she requested preparing a separation, but asked that it not be filed yet. She explained that Adrian had begun to humiliate her, to control her visits, and to treat her as a burden, although she still hoped to recover the man she married. She also mentioned Valeria for the first time. She didn't affirm that a relationship existed, but described nighttime calls, trips without explanation, and expenses that Adrian hid. At the end of the letter, Lucia had written that she didn't want to return to her father defeated. Adrian read that phrase until the letters became blurry. He understood that his wife had been thinking about leaving for years, and that she had stayed not out of weakness, but out of shame and hope. The hospital night hadn't created the rupture, it had only destroyed the last reason she had kept to stay. Adrian kept the letter in his pocket, although he knew it didn't belong to him, and that keeping it couldn't return anything to him. Valeria, suspended from her functions, took refuge in the hotel where it all began. From there, she called several journalists and offered a version in which the Ferrers used a medical emergency to take over an independent company. No serious media published the accusation without proof, but the rumor began to circulate. She also contacted Mercedes and proposed acting before Lucia letters reappeared. They managed for Adrian to formally report her disappearance and alleged concern for her mental health. They could request judicial information about the destination hospital. Mercedes hesitated. She knew any lie could turn against them, but she feared losing control over her son and her future grandson. Valeria insisted that Lucia couldn't present herself as a victim if there was a file showing her unstable. However, she didn't know that Innes had kept the drafts, and that Tomas had already verified their origin. Each attempt by Valeria to close the trap left a new trail. Even so, she still trusted that Adrian would choose to protect his reputation before recognizing the truth. On the 3rd day, Tomas delivered a preliminary report to Lucia letters. The suspicious transfers amounted to an amount sufficient to justify legal actions and an independent investigation. There were also indications of unauthorized use of Adrian's digital signature, although it had to be determined whether he had tolerated that practice. Most worrying was the incapacity protocol. Lucia read the phrases written about her: emotional dependence, judgment altered by pregnancy, unpredictable conduct, and risk to the stability of the heir. None of the authors had evaluated her. They had turned her moments of pain into tools to silence her. Esteban wanted to stop the reading, but Lucia continued to the end. She didn't cry. She asked what they needed to prove intent. Tomas mentioned testimonies, edit records, messages, and any proof that Mercedes or Valeria planned to use the document. Lucia remembered several occasions when her mother-in-law insisted on accompanying her to the family psychiatrist and requested copies of her medical reports. Until then, she had interpreted it as a clumsy form of concern. Now she understood that they were building a story about her. Adrian received a formal summons to appear before the auditors and answer for the expenses. Along with the summons was a notification of legal representation signed by Lucia Isabel Ferrer. Seeing her maiden name produced an unexpected pain. It was the clearest sign that she had left the territory he considered his. He called Tomas, and this time the lawyer answered. Adrian asked to speak with Lucia, even if only for a minute. Tomas asked him what he wanted to say to her. He spoke of his right to know if the baby was alive. The lawyer answered that the child remained under medical care without offering more details, and reminded him that Lucia had called 3 times when she needed her husband. Adrian fell silent. Finally, he asked if he could send her a letter. Tomas agreed to deliver it as long as it contained no threats, pressures, or demands. Adrian spent hours in front of a blank sheet. He discovered that asking for forgiveness was difficult when every phrase began with an explanation meant to save himself. That same afternoon, the doctors informed Lucia that they would probably have to advance the birth. The placenta couldn't sustain the pregnancy much longer, and the baby showed signs of exhaustion. They explained the risks with clarity. Respiratory difficulties, low weight, possible neurological complications, and weeks in intensive care. Lucia listened without looking away. Esteban held her hand and promised that the best team would be ready. She answered that she didn't want useless privileges. Only capable doctors and honest decisions. Before signing the surgical authorization, she asked Tomas for one last document. Statement noting that if she became unconscious, Esteban would make medical decisions in her name, and Adrian could not intervene until a judge evaluated the situation. She signed slowly, aware of the gravity of the gesture. She wasn't denying her husband's existence. She was protecting herself from a man who had demonstrated that he could abandon an emergency for a convenient lie. When finished, she asked that a copy be kept with the separation file. Adrian's letter arrived that night. Lucia held it without opening for several minutes. Finally, she broke the envelope. He had written that he didn't know how serious the situation was, that Valeria deceived him, and that he acted under pressure. He also assured that he never would have left the hospital if he had understood the real risk. He didn't mention that the doctor explained it to him, nor that he saw the blood, nor that he pulled his wife's hand away. At the end, he asked to know if the child was alive and promised to fix everything. Lucia folded the letter and returned it to Tomas. He still thinks the problem was not understanding, she said. The problem was that he saw me suffer and decided that someone else was more important. She didn't respond. In the hallway, Esteban observed his daughter with an immobile face. She seemed fragile under the hospital light, but the decision in her voice was firmer than any of the contracts that had sustained the Vega Group. Hours later, an auditor sent Adrian the complete map of the financial guarantees. At the center of all the lines appeared the same company administered for Lucia's benefit. Outer. The first promotion would have been seized. The second would never have received credit, and the Vega Group would never have come to exist as he knew it. Adrian remained alone in the boardroom, surrounded by photographs of buildings he considered monuments to his effort. For the first time, he saw something else. Each tower bore an invisible signature of Lucia Elters. She had protected the payrolls, negotiated deadlines through Tomas, and sacrificed personal benefits so that he could present himself to the world as a self-made man. Now, that invisible signature had become the only one capable of stopping him. When he looked at the city through the glass, he understood that he had spent years believing that his wife lived under his shadow. The truth was exactly the opposite. He had built his power within the silent protection of a woman he never took the trouble to know. The cesarean was scheduled for 6 in the morning, but Lucia's body decided sooner. At 4:17, the fetal monitor emitted a prolonged alarm and several nurses ran in. The baby's heart rate had dropped dangerously. The responsible doctor explained that they could no longer wait. As they pushed the stretcher toward the operating room, Lucia searched for Esteban with her gaze. Her father walked beside her, holding her hand up to where the doors allowed. Lucia didn't ask if everything would turn out well, because she knew no one could promise that. She only asked that if something happened to her. She protected her daughter from those who intended to turn her into a surname, an inheritance, or a bargaining chip. Esteban answered that he would protect her as he hadn't known how to protect her. The doors closed, and he remained motionless in the hallway, while Tomas received an urgent call. The Vega Group's board had moved up the definitive meeting and demanded Frere Capital's presence. The intervention lasted less than an hour, although to Esteban, it seemed a lifetime. The girl's cry wasn't heard immediately. The doctors transferred her directly to an incubator and began helping her breathe. Lucia, conscious but exhausted, managed to see a tiny body covered in cables before getting lost among voices and lights. The girl weighed a little more than 1.5 kilos. The neonatologist explained that the first hours would be decisive, but that she had reacted to ventilation and showed signs of strength. Lucia asked that they call her Alma. She had chosen that name weeks ago, when she still believed that Adrian would be by her side during the birth. Now she pronounced it without bitterness. Elma wouldn't belong to a war between families. She would be the proof that a life could begin, even in the middle of a betrayal. When she woke up in recovery, Tomas informed her that the board would meet that same afternoon. Lucia asked to attend. The doctors objected. She answered that she didn't want to confront Adrian out of revenge, but to prevent others from deciding her history before she could speak. Adrian arrived at the Vega Group's headquarters, surrounded by lawyers. But without the usual security, in recent days, he had tried to reconstruct every step that led him there. He found emails in which Valeria requested payments using his name messages from Mercedes about control of the heir, and drafts intended to present Lucia as an emotionally incapable woman. He also found his own brief and negligent responses, where he authorized Valeria to resolve matters without bothering him. He hadn't directly participated in all the plans, but he had created the space where they could grow. Even so, he still clung to a hope. If he demonstrated that Valeria deceived him and that he didn't understand the scope of the emergency, Lucia perhaps would agree to speak. Before entering the boardroom, he asked Tomas if she was alive. The lawyer answered that Lucia had undergone an intervention and that the girl was in intensive care. Adrian leaned a hand against the wall. His daughter had been born, and he hadn't been there. The news didn't produce complete joy, but the unbearable awareness of everything he had lost. The meeting began with the reading of the audit report. Valeria was suspended but had demanded to attend, accompanied by her lawyer. Mercedes occupied a chair at the back with a hardened face and hands clenched over her bag. The auditors presented transfers to companies linked to Valeria's family, personal payments charged as representation, and several unauthorized accesses to Adrian's electronic signature. They also showed the incapacity protocol drafted for Lucia, along with the messages proving Mercedes knew of its existence. The board members reacted with disbelief. Valeria denied planning to use it. She claimed it was a preventive document requested by the risk department in case of a possible health crisis. Innes, called as a witness, entered the room and testified that Valeria ordered her to gather medical information.
Photographs and private comments to build an image of instability?
Yes.
Mercedes tried to interrupt her, but the board president demanded silence. Adrian heard each phrase as if someone described a conspiracy that occurred inside his own house. Admitted having maintained a relationship with Valeria and having allowed her to use certain company resources. He denied knowing the larger transfers and the incapacity plan. One of the board members asked if he knew that his wife had been transferred from the emergency room the night he was in a hotel with the communications director. Adrian answered yes. The next question was simpler. Why did he leave? He explained that Valeria had threatened to hurt herself. The auditor then showed the hotel records. There were no calls to emergency services, requests for medical assistance, or medication purchases. The hallway camera showed Valeria entering the suite with a bottle of champagne minutes before calling Adrian. The room filled with murmurs. Valeria shouted that the images didn't prove her emotional state. Tomas asked to play an audio recovered from the corporate phone. Before it began, Adrian recognized the date. It was the same night he abandoned the hospital. Something in Valeria's face revealed that she knew exactly what they were going to hear. In the recording, Valeria's voice sounded calm, almost amused. She talked with a friend while waiting for Adrian and confessed that she had invented the crisis to check if he was capable of choosing her over his wife. She said that a pregnant woman always seemed more vulnerable and that if Adrian came to the hotel, he could no longer pretend that his marriage still came first. She added that Luce would end up forgiving him because she had renounced her family and had nowhere to return. The recording ended with a laugh. For several seconds, no one spoke. Adrian looked at Valeria as if seeing her for the first time. She tried to explain that it was a private conversation, an exaggeration without real intent. He asked her if she knew that Lucia was bleeding. Valeria answered that she thought it was a minor scare. Tomas showed the record of the call that she answered from Adrian's phone and cut off after saying they shouldn't ruin the night for them. The lie no longer had refuge. Valeria had heard Lucia's voice and had chosen to silence it. Sadie stood up and declared that all of this was Valeria's responsibility. She claimed that she too had been manipulated and that her messages about the heir only reflected concern for family continuity. Tomas then projected a conversation in which Mercedes suggested taking advantage of the birth to pressure Lucia while she was weak. She had also recommended that Valeria move into the penthouse before her daughter-in-law returned, so that the separation seemed irreversible. Adrian turned toward his mother with a distraught face. Mercedes insisted that she acted to protect him. He answered that protecting a son didn't consist of destroying the mother of his granddaughter. The word granddaughter made Mercedes lose part of her hardness. She asked if the girl was alive. Tomas answered that she remained in intensive care and that any contact would depend on Lucia and judicial decisions. Mercedes dropped into the chair. For years she had spoken of the baby as heir, but had never imagined that she could be born without her having the right to even approach the incubator. In the hospital, Lucia insisted on getting up a few hours after the operation. The doctor refused to authorize a physical transfer to Madrid. But Esteban organized a secure connection so she could participate from a private room. Lucia was pale in pain and connected to an IV line. Tomas recommended she wait. She answered that she had waited too long throughout her life. She waited for Adrian to recognize her sacrifices, for Mercedes to accept her, for Valeria to go away, and for her marriage to recover a truth that no longer existed. She didn't want to enter the meeting as a powerful heiress, but as the woman about whom everyone had spoken without permission. Before activating the connection, she asked to see Alma. The nurse took her in a wheelchair to the neonatal unit. Through the glass, Luce contemplated her daughter under a blue light. Breathing with help, she placed her hand on the incubator and promised that she would never teach her to endure contempt to preserve a family. Then she returned to the room and asked that the camera be turned on. When Lucia's face appeared on the main screen, Adrian stood up. No one asked him to. It was an involuntary reaction, as if all the power he had tried to keep was reduced before that weakened yet still serene woman. Lucia wore a hospital gown and her hair tied back anyway. She didn't look like a businesswoman prepared for a fight, but the entire room fell silent. Adrian pronounced her name and took a step toward the screen. She didn't respond. Tomas explained that Lucia had agreed to appear to clarify her position as beneficiary of the guarantees and potential victim of the incapacity documents. The president asked if she wanted to withdraw her financial support. Lucia answered that she wouldn't make a decision meant to punish innocent employees. She proposed temporarily maintaining the guarantees under independent administration, removing those who had used funds irregularly, and auditing each operation. Her answer surprised several board members. Even in the moment of greatest power, she didn't seek to burn the company, but to prevent it from continuing to be used as personal property. And Lucia asked that the record of her calls from the emergency room be shown. On the screen appeared 3 attempts made minutes apart. She explained that the first call was rejected, the second ignored, and the third answered by Valeria. She didn't raise her voice or describe the fear with drama. She only listed facts: the blood, the drop in fetal rhythm, the medical warning, and Adrian's departure. Then she showed the transfer request, signed at 23:48. "I didn't disappear. To punish you," she said, looking directly at her husband. "I disappeared because staying within your reach was no longer safe for my daughter or for me." Adrian tried to respond that he didn't understand the severity. Lucia shook her head. She recalled that Alina had explained the risk to him, and that even so he chose to leave. "You didn't lack information," she added. You lacked the will to believe that my pain deserved to stop your night. The phrase wasn't an insult, but left Adrian without defense. Valeria interrupted from her seat and accused Lucia of using illness to appropriate the company. She claimed that everything had been prepared by the Ferrers from the beginning. Lucia asked if they had also prepared the false call to corporate expenses and the plan to declare her incapable. Valeria answered that Adrian knew more than he admitted. Then she opened a folder and assured that she could prove that he authorized several transfers. Her lawyer tried to stop her, but she was already desperate. She delivered messages where Adrian approved gifts, trips, and reservations without asking their origin. They didn't prove that he knew the complete fraud, but confirmed that he had used the company to maintain the relationship. The board observed Adrian with a mix of disappointment and repulsion. He didn't deny messages, admitted that he believed he could separate his private life from his responsibilities. Lucia answered that there was never separation. Every personal lie was paid for with workers' money. Every absence was covered with corporate excuses, and every privilege granted to Valeria ended up converted into power against other people. Tomas then presented the waiver draft that Mercedes and Valeria intended Lucia to sign after childbirth. The document removed her voting power over certain assets, transferred temporary administration to Adrian, and allowed the Vega family to decide patrimonial aspects of the baby. Mercedes insisted that it never got signed. Lucia answered that the failure of a plan didn't eliminate its intent. She recalled a conversation that occurred months ago, when her mother-in-law told her that mothers should think less about their rights and more about the stability of the surname. Then she believed it was a cruel opinion. Now she knew it was a warning. The board president asked Adrian if he had seen the draft. He answered no. Lucia didn't accuse him of lying. She said something harder, that he didn't need to know every detail to be responsible for the environment that allowed it to grow. He had given power to Valeria, tolerated Mercedes' contempt, and treated his wife's silence as consent. His ignorance wasn't innocence, but the result of never asking who paid the price of his comfort. The economic police entered the headquarters before the meeting ended. The complaint was based on transfers, falsification of authorizations, and potential destruction of evidence. The agents requested Valeria's devices and informed her that she had to accompany them to make a statement. She reacted with fury, pointed at Adrian, and shouted that he had enjoyed every trip, every gift, and every night paid for by the company. Then she looked at Mercedes and reminded her that she was the one who promised her a place in the family if she managed to remove Lucia letters. Neither of them could pretend dignity. Valeria tried to approach the screen where Lucia appeared, but an agent stopped her. "You didn't win," she shouted. Lucia looked at her without hatred. She answered that this had never been a competition between two women. The only prize that Valeria wanted to win was a man willing to abandon the mother of his daughter in the emergency room. The phrase made Valeria fall silent. For the first time, she understood that even her supposed victory had been a form of degradation. The board voted for Adrian's immediate suspension as CEO until the investigation concluded. They also revoked all his financial accesses and designated an independent committee supervised by creditors. Adrian received the decision without protesting. He'd spent hours trying to keep the position, but after seeing Lucia from the hospital, losing the position seemed secondary. He requested to speak with her privately. Lucia accepted only with Tomas present, when the room emptied. Adrian approached the screen and asked about Alma. Lucia confirmed that she was alive. Although she needed help breathing and would remain weeks in intensive care, he covered his mouth and began to cry. He said he wanted to see her. Lucia answered that desire wasn't enough, and that any visit would depend on legal and medical evaluation. Adrian asked for forgiveness for not being present during the birth. She answered that his absence began much earlier. Every time he turned his doubts into exaggerations and allowed other people to treat her as an obstacle. Adrian asked if there was any chance of recovering the family. Lucia contemplated the camera during a long silence. She told him that she still didn't know if someday she could forgive him, but she knew that she wouldn't return to the marriage. He tried to remind her of the good years, the house, the trips, and the promises. Lucia answered that she also remembered them, and precisely because of that, she had taken so long to leave. She had confused the memory of a love with the obligation to endure what it became. Adrian insisted that Valeria manipulated him. She didn't deny it, but added that no manipulation forced him to pull his hand away from his wife or to leave the hospital after seeing the blood. "She prepared the lie," said Lucia letters. "You made the decision." Adrian lowered his gaze. For the first time, he accepted the phrase without looking for an explanation. He asked what he should do. Lucia answered that he started by telling the truth before the company, the justice system, and his own daughter, even if that truth didn't return anything to him. Mercedes waited for Adrian outside the boardroom. She asked him not to let the Ferrers take the company and the girl. He looked at her with weariness. He told her that Alma wasn't an asset that could be taken away or recovered, and that Lucia didn't belong to any family as property. Mercedes accused Esteban of having planned every move. Adrian answered that Esteban wasn't the one who turned off the phone, paid for the hotel, or wrote a protocol to incapacitate a pregnant woman. His mother tried to hug him, but he stepped back. He asked for the keys to the penthouse and ordered that all her belongings be removed before Lucia decided what to do with the house. Mercedes reminded him that she had helped build his social position. Adrian answered that they had all built something on Lucia's sacrifices and then acted as if she were a guest. Mercedes left without saying goodbye. In the elevator, she received a formal notification. She was suspended from any function linked to the family foundation, and a review of her expenses would begin. After the meeting, Lucia was transferred back to the neonatal unit. The effort had intensified the pain of the operation, but she refused to take sedatives until she saw Alma. The nurse opened a small port in the incubator and allowed her to insert her hand. The girl's tiny fingers closed around one of hers. Lucia cried in silence. It wasn't the cry of an abandoned wife, nor of a daughter who returned defeated. It was the cry of a mother who had survived long enough to choose a different life. Esteban remained behind without interrupting. When Lucia asked him to approach, he placed his hand next to hers. 3 generations were united around a fragile body that breathed thanks to a machine. Esteban promised that he wouldn't use his influence to decide for them. Lucia answered that that was all she needed, support without control. Her father understood that that request was also an opportunity to repair his own mistakes. Tomas arrived with the council's provisional resolution and confirmation that Valeria was being questioned. He also informed that the prosecutor's office would study charges for misappropriation, document falsification, and obstruction, especially for the use of credentials, and the attempt to destroy files. Mercedes still wasn't criminally charged, but her messages could implicate her in civil and family actions. Lucia listened without satisfaction. She asked about the Vega Group's employees. Tomas answered that the independent administration would maintain operations and review contracts to avoid layoffs. She approved the plan, then signed the formal divorce petition. This time she didn't tremble. The document wasn't a declaration of war, but the legal recognition of a rupture that occurred in box number 7. When finished, she placed the pen on the table and asked that Adrian receive a copy through his lawyers. She didn't want him to find out through the press. Although he hadn't offered her dignity in the emergency room, she wouldn't allow her own departure to resemble the cruelty she was leaving behind. That night, Adrian returned alone to the penthouse. Valeria's suitcase remained next to the sofa, but she was in custody. Lucia's belongings remained in the immobile closets like witnesses of a life that would never occupy those rooms again. Adrian entered the baby's room and turned on the lamp shaped like a moon. On a table he found a notebook where Lucia had written down names, medical appointments, and questions for the pediatrician. On a page appeared the word Alma, surrounded by a circle. Below, Lucia had written that she wanted to teach her daughter not to confuse love with fear. Adrian sat on the floor next to the empty crib. His phone vibrated with the divorce notification. Minutes later, he received a photograph sent by Tomas with Lucia's authorization Alma inside the incubator, barely visible under a blanket. There was no message. Adrian observed the image until dawn, aware that his daughter had come into the world while he defended a lie he could no longer sustain. 3 weeks after Alma's birth, the neonatal unit still marked the rhythm of Lucy's life. Every morning she arrived in a wheelchair, placed her hand on the incubator and talked to her daughter about simple things. The light on the trees, the smell of coffee that Esteban brought to the hallway, the song her mother sang to her when she was a girl. Alma still needed help breathing but had gained weight and was beginning to react to the sound of her voice. In that space full of alarms and tubes, Lucia learned a different kind of patience. It was no longer the passive waiting of someone who trusts that another will change, but the active resistance of a mother who prepares to protect. Adrian sent letters through Tomas. He didn't ask her to withdraw the divorce. He informed about his therapy sessions. his collaboration with the audit, and every statement he had given. Lucia didn't respond, but read them. She needed to check if his actions were beginning to match his words. The investigation against Valeria progressed rapidly. The technicians recovered deleted files, messages with instructions to alter invoices, and transfers made through her cousin's company. They also found a document in which she had calculated how much money she could control if Adrian obtained temporary administration of Lucia's assets. The prosecutor's office charged her with misappropriation, document falsification, and fraudulent use of corporate credentials. The attempt to hide the emergency call didn't constitute the most serious crime by itself, but it became the moral proof that defined her conduct before public opinion. Valeria tried to present herself as a deceived lover by a married man, but the recordings showed that she knew about the pregnancy. She had manufactured the crisis and considered Lucia an economic obstacle. Her lawyer negotiated a reduction in sentence in exchange for returning part of the money and collaborating with the investigation. She accepted not out of remorse, but because she understood that Adrian would no longer destroy the company to save her. Mercedes faced different consequences, equally profound. She hadn't signed the transfers or used Adrian's passwords, but her messages demonstrated that she had participated in the plan to discredit Lucia and pressure her after childbirth. The council expelled her from all representative functions and froze the expenses of the foundation she administered. Several charitable organizations broke their agreements upon learning that she had used solidarity meetings to justify private payments. Mercedes lost the invitations, the honorary positions, and the social influence that for years she confused with respect. She tried to visit Alma, but Lucia refused. She didn't do it to punish her, but because Mercedes still spoke of the girl as the Vega heir and not as a baby fighting to breathe. Through Tomas Luce, communicated that any future contact would depend on a family evaluation and her capacity to recognize the harm caused. Mercedes responded with a letter full of excuses. Lucia returned it unopened. She wasn't obligated to listen to an apology that still demanded understanding before assuming responsibility. Adrian appeared before the board for the last time a month after his suspension. The audit concluded that he had authorized personal expenses, tolerated deficient controls, and handed over financial access without supervision. It wasn't proven that he planned Valeria's fraudulent transfers or the incapacity protocol, but his negligence allowed both. The board members offered him remaining as a minority shareholder without executive functions. As long as he sold personal properties to cover part of the damage and renounced any claim against Ferrer Capital, Adrian accepted. He sold the Penthouse 2 vehicles, a house in Marbella, and an art collection acquired during the years of greatest success. For the first time, his economic decisions weren't aimed at preserving an image, but at repairing concrete damage. During his final statement, he recognized that the Vega Group hadn't been built solely by him. He publicly mentioned Lucia's guarantee, the dividends she sacrificed, and the jobs she protected. That confession destroyed the myth of the self-made businessman, but it was also the first truth he pronounced without trying to benefit from it. The family trial was held when Alma turned 2 months old. Luce arrived accompanied by Tomas while Adrian entered alone with his lawyer. Neither sought the press, although several media waited outside the courthouse. The judge reviewed the medical reports, the rejected calls, Elena's testimony, and Adrian's subsequent conduct. He also studied his participation in therapy, his collaboration with justice, and his recognition of the facts. Lucia didn't ask for his parental rights to be permanently withdrawn. She requested supervised visits without Mercedes' presence until Alma was medically stable and Adrian demonstrated consistency. When the judge asked her why she allowed some contact after what happened, Lucia answered that her daughter had the right to know the truth about her father, not an idealized version nor an absence created by revenge, but she also had the right to grow up safe. The resolution established brief visits in the hospital accompanied by a family psychologist and prohibited Adrian from making medical or patrimonial decisions without authorization from Lucia or the court. The first visit occurred on a rainy afternoon. Adrian entered the neonatal unit after washing his hands and putting on a sterile gown. He seemed thinner, without the perfect suit, nor the confidence that had defined him. When he saw Alma inside the incubator, he stopped several steps away. The girl moved her fingers under a white blanket. The psychologist indicated that he could approach, but he looked at Lucia as if he needed permission. She nodded. Adrian inserted a hand through the opening and touched his daughter's tiny foot. He began to cry without sound. He said that everything would change, nor did he promise to recover the family. He only pronounced Alma's name and confessed that he hadn't been there when she came into the world. Lucia remained by the window observing. That man wasn't yet a good father for having cried before an incubator, but at least he had stopped claiming the place as if it belonged to him automatically. For 20 minutes he talked with the girl and then left when the nurse asked him to without arguing or demanding more time. Alma was discharged after 74 days. She weighed more than 2.5 kilos, breathed without help, and only needed frequent checkups. Esteban prepared a room in his house, but Lucia refused to return permanently to the mansion where she grew up. She appreciated her father's protection, although she didn't want to replace the dependence on a husband with that of a powerful family. A bright apartment near the hospital adapted to the girl's needs and paid with her own income. Esteban accepted the decision without arguing, offered her discreet security, a night nurse, and all the support she needed, but let Lucia choose. That way of accompanying her repaired something between them. For years, Esteban had tried to protect her through warnings and control. Now he understood that loving an adult daughter meant staying close without taking over her path. Lucia, for her part, stopped interpreting all help as a threat against her independence. She learned that accepting a hand didn't force her to give up her own voice. The legal separation concluded without a public battle. Adrian renounced claiming the assets contributed by Lucia and accepted returning the amounts that the audit linked to personal expenses. She didn't request the Vega Group's ruin, nor use the guarantees to take over the company. Ferrer Capital maintained its support under professional administration until workers and suppliers were protected. Then, Lucia decided to convert part of her participation into a stable fund for employees, so that no future decision could put their salaries at risk because of an executive's whims. Many expected her to use economic power to humiliate Adrian. But she understood that true reparation didn't consist of reproducing cruelty. He had to lose what he had used irresponsibly, not everything that could sustain a dignified life. The divorce decree recognized that the rupture occurred due to abandonment, infidelity, and patrimonial harm. When Lucia received the document, she didn't celebrate. She kept it along with the hospital bracelet and Elma's first photograph as testimonies of a closed life and another newly begun. Tomas delivered to Lucia a box found during the penthouse review. It contained letters, ultrasounds, photographs, and the separation draft she wrote 3 years ago. There was also the ring she had left in the emergency room. Adrian had kept it until his lawyer recommended returning it. Lucia held the ring between her fingers. She didn't feel the sharp pain of that night, but a serene sadness for the woman she had been. She remembered how hard she tried to be enough, how many times she silenced a suspicion to avoid an argument, and how many decisions she made thinking that love should protect the other even from the truth. She didn't throw the ring away, nor did she keep it as a relic. She asked that it be melted down, and the metal transformed into a small star for Alma. She didn't want her daughter to inherit the symbol of a broken marriage, but the proof that something painful could acquire another meaning. Tomas smiled and promised to take care of it. The star would have an engraved date. The day Lucia signed the transfer and chose to survive. The idea for the new fund was born during a conversation with Alina. The doctor told her that many women entered the emergency room without resources, without close family, or accompanied by partners who controlled their documents and decisions. Some couldn't request a transfer, pay for legal advice, or find accommodation after discharge. Lucia understood that she had been able to escape because she kept a card, powerful surname, and a father capable of mobilizing a medical team in minutes. Other women faced the same loneliness without any door open. She decided to create the Alma Ferrer Foundation, aimed at offering medical care, psychological assistance, legal advice, and temporary housing to pregnant women in situations of abandonment or economic violence. Esteban contributed the initial capital, but Lucia demanded independent administration and transparent criteria. She didn't want an institution built to clean her family's name, but a real protection network. Alina agreed to direct the medical program, and Tomas organized a legal team. The first center opened near the hospital where Lucia had been treated, a few kilometers from the place where Adrian left her. During the inauguration, Lucia refused to publicly tell all the details of her marriage. She said that the foundation shouldn't depend on her scandal, but on a social need that existed before and would continue after. However, she shared a simple phrase: no woman should be forced to choose between her safety and the fear of admitting that a relationship had failed. The first beneficiaries arrived that same week. A pregnant waitress who had been kicked out of her home received housing. A young woman without legal residence accessed prenatal checkups. A mother of two obtained advice to recover documents withheld by her partner. Lucia visited the center with Alma in her arms, listening to stories that reminded her how close she came to being lost within her shame. She didn't present herself as a savior. She knew that money opened doors, but dignity consisted in allowing each woman to decide how to cross them. The foundation didn't force reporting, reconciling, or separating. It offered information, time, and a safe place from which to choose. Adrian continued attending therapy and complying with supervised visits. At first, he talked too much about his guilt, as if suffering could prove he had changed. The psychologist explained that guilt centered on oneself was another form of selfishness. He had to learn to observe Alma's expectations without expecting recognition from Lucia letters. He began arriving on time to study medical reports and to ask before touching or deciding. When the girl had a fever for the first time, he didn't appear without permission or demand to enter. Offered help, and waited. Lucia accepted that he'd send a pediatrician recommended by the hospital, although the final decision remained in her hands. Months later, the visits took place without constant supervision, always in agreed spaces. Adrian never regained Lucia's trust as a husband, but he began slowly to build a relationship with Alma. It was a process without guarantees. Each advance depended on repeated acts, not grand promises. He understood that reparation wasn't a path toward forgiveness, but an obligation, even if no one forgave him. Valeria received a reduced sentence after returning funds and collaborating with the investigation. Before entering prison, she sent a letter to Lucia. She claimed that Adrian had promised her a life he never intended to offer her, and that she became cruel out of fear of remaining the hidden woman. Lucia read the letter only once. She understood that Valeria had also been used by Adrian's lies. But that didn't erase the decisions she made against a vulnerable woman or the money she stole. She responded through her lawyer, with a phrase understanding. The origin of a conduct doesn't mean absolving its consequences. And she closed the matter. She didn't want to dedicate more life to hating her. Valeria would have to face the justice system and perhaps someday face herself. Mercedes took longer to change. She spent months blaming everyone until her social isolation and distance from Adrian forced her to recognize that she had treated people as pieces of the Vegas surname. She began therapy, but Lucia maintained the boundaries. A late transformation didn't grant automatic access to Alma. A year after the night in the emergency room, Lucia returned to the original hospital to participate in the opening of an Alma Foundation office. Alina accompanied her to box number 7, which was empty. The room seemed smaller than she remembered. Same white light fell on the bed and the metal railing reflected the hallway. Lucia held Alma, already capable of sitting and observing everything with curiosity. For a few minutes, she remained silent. She didn't need to reconstruct every second, because her body still remembered the blood, fear, and the door closing behind Adrian. However, she no longer saw herself as the woman abandoned in that bed. She saw herself as the woman who found a card, made a call, and signed her exit. Alina asked if she wanted to leave. Lucia answered no. She entered with Alma in her arms and sat by the window. That space no longer belonged to the worst moment of her life. It was also the place where she stopped waiting for someone to choose her and began to choose herself. Adrian came later to pick up Alma during a scheduled visit. It was the first time he and Lucia coincided in that hospital since the separation. They met in the lobby in front of the automatic doors, through which he had walked out behind Valeria's call. Adrian looked at his daughter, then at Lucia letters, and admitted that for months he had thought the greatest punishment was having lost the company and the marriage. Now he understood that the true punishment was remembering that he had an opportunity to protect them, and decided not to do it. Lucia answered that she didn't want him to live punishing himself forever. She wanted him to use that memory to never again abandon anyone who depended on him. Adrian asked why she never told her that she had saved the Vega group. Lucia held his gaze and explained that she wanted to be loved as a wife, not retained as an heiress. She wanted him to choose her company without knowing how much money, influence, or security she carried behind. When he finally learned the truth, he had already demonstrated what he chose when he believed she had nothing. He asked her if she had ever truly loved him. Lucia answered yes, and precisely because of that, the betrayal had been so deep. She didn't need to turn the past into a lie to justify the present. There were sincere years, real promises, and moments of happiness, but love didn't freeze people in the best version they ever showed. Adrian had changed, and she too. The woman who before confused permanence with loyalty no longer existed. Adrian nodded. He took Alma's bag and waited for Lucia to hand him the girl. Before leaving, he promised to return her at the agreed time. He added nothing more. Lucia watched them cross the doors and didn't feel fear. She had documents, limits, and a history of behavior that she could now evaluate. Trusting didn't mean closing her eyes, but looking clearly and deciding how much space to grant. Adrian no longer had power over her life. He only had the opportunity to demonstrate day after day what kind of father he wished to be. That afternoon, Lucia returned to her apartment and found on the table the small star made from the ring's metal. The chain was thin, and the date was engraved on the back. She placed the pendant inside a box destined for Alma, along with a letter that her daughter would read when she was older. In it, she didn't describe Adrian as a monster, nor herself as a perfect victim. She told her that people could love and cause harm, regret, and still not recover what was lost. She explained that forgiveness was an intimate decision, but returning was never an obligation. She also told her that asking for help didn't reduce anyone's strength, and that no worthy relationship demanded giving up one's own voice to avoid making the other feel small. Lucia closed the box and kept it on a high shelf. She didn't want to raise Alma from the fear of repeating her history, but from the freedom to recognize the signs that she had ignored. Over the years, the Alma Foundation opened centers in Madrid, Valencia, and Seville. Thousands of women received support without having to first prove they were perfect victims. Lucia directed the projects, but kept her life far from society magazines. Esteban became a patient grandfather, more willing to listen than to order. Adrian never again occupied the Vega Group's management. He worked as an advisor in a smaller company and destined part of his income to return what he owed. His relationship with Alma grew with clear boundaries, agreed weekends, and an honesty that didn't try to erase the past. Mercedes managed occasional visits after years of therapy, and only when she agreed to stop. Talking about inheritances in front of the girl, Valeria, after serving her sentence, disappeared from public life. No consequence was perfect or instant, but each character ended up inhabiting the result of their decisions. The truth didn't destroy their lives. It simply stopped protecting the lies that sustained them. One spring morning, Lucia walked with Alma through the garden of the foundation, while several families waited for their first consultation. The girl, already big enough to run, wore the platinum star around her neck. She asked why it had a date engraved. Lucia crouched and answered that day both began the journey toward a different life. Alma wanted to know if it was a sad day. Mother smiled. She said that some days could be sad and brave at the same time. Then the girl ran toward Esteban, who waited next to a bench. Lucia remained watching them under the morning light. For years she had believed that returning to her father meant accepting a defeat. Now she understood that returning to a safe place had only been the first step. The true victory consisted in building a home where she no longer needed to hide her name, minimize her power, or ask permission to be heard. Lucia didn't disappear again, not because everyone knew where she lived, but because she stopped hiding within a life designed not to make others uncomfortable. She had loved, had made mistakes, had endured too much, and finally had chosen to leave. Her story didn't teach that money healed any wound, because money didn't prevent her from being betrayed, nor did it return the hours of fear with her daughter. What changed her destiny was recognizing that dignity shouldn't be negotiated to preserve a marriage, and that true protection never demanded silence in exchange. Adrian lost the woman who sustained him because he confused patience with dependence. Valeria lost the future she desired because she believed that destroying another woman could turn her into a winner. Lucia, on the other hand, recovered something that no fortune could buy her: the right to decide who she allowed to approach her, and what kind of love she would accept from then on. Sometimes leaving isn't abandoning a family, It's preventing cruelty from continuing to be called love.